And my parents came home with lots of stories and souvenirs and that sort of thing. So Burmese things around the house, and Burma being a real place in my mind. I was 8 years old at that time. But the way I got my news about Burma was from Mary Kay Magstad, reporting, and it was very difficult to keep up. Access to information was just a completely different world. In any community, there were a few people who knew about Burma, who cared about Burma. And if you created an opportunity for them to come together, they would. And so that's, so it sort of took place at two levels. On the one hand, nationally connecting with the Free Burma Coalition, and on the other hand, locally, just finding these people. And at that time, it was gather phone numbers, and then the few days before the meeting, just bang through and call everybody and say, oh, the meeting's going to take place. This was, email existed, but it wasn't really heavily used, and certainly wasn't heavily used by me in the early 90s.
Before we get into today's show, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to share your thoughts and opinions on our work. If you have feedback, ideas, or suggestions relating to any part of our overall platform, we'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We are listening. Your insights help us grow and ensure that we're making the greatest impact possible. To share your thoughts, go to insightmyanmar.org/feedback. Larry Dohrs, thank you so much for joining us at Insight Myanmar podcast.
Thank you. It's my honor.
You've had a lifelong relationship with Burma. As you explained it before we started recording, it goes back actually to the 60s and then reoccurs again in the 80s and is pretty consistent after that. Tell us where it started in the 1960s.
Well, my mother's cousin was married to a gentleman who was an engineer for USAID. And as everybody would know, in the mid-1960s, there were very, very few foreigners. It was the sort of early mid-Ne Win era. But they wanted him to build bridges, and so they had him in country. And my dad was a geography professor, so travel was kind of part of the deal. And my parents did a trip and spent 10 days in 1967 in Burma, and going around, getting to a lot of different places. And so of course they came home with lots of stories and souvenirs and that sort of thing. So Burmese things around the house, and Burma being a real place in my mind. I was 8 years old at that time. So they were away for a couple months for that trip, and 10 days of which was in Burma. And again, that's very, very rare. You just don't hear of people being able to have that sort of experience at that time period.
How did the trip impact them, and what did they tell you about their experience?
I think it was, my dad had hitchhiked all over Europe and had lots of travel experience. My mom had a good amount of travel experience, but also mostly in Europe. And I think it had the effect that, again, many of us experience when we go there, of such an unusual place, such welcoming people, just so interesting. Every place you look, something new and different and exciting and interesting is going on. And I think that was, it was the highlight of that trip, where they ended up actually going around the world. They didn't make it to Israel because of the 6-Day War. So that was the era. But they talked about it for years afterwards. It really did make a very, very strong impact. It was not easy, you can imagine. It was fairly rugged travel, and sleeping arrangements and things like that when you went up country were not super comfortable from a Western perspective. But they had a great time and just never forgot it.
Right. And so then your experience directly started in 1982 during a visit. What was that like, and what brought you there?
Yeah, that was, so after college in the United States, I graduated in 81. It wasn't a great economy. I thought I would just go to Australia and never come back. So I went to Australia and got good work there, worked for a year, saved up a lot of money, and then spent another year traveling mostly in Southeast Asia, but also East Asia, spending some of that money. So it was really, sort of the Lonely Planet, Yellow Bible era of travel. And I started in Bali, did a 10-day bicycle trip in Bali and Lombok on a single-speed bicycle, which is hard to do because it's kind of hilly there. Made my way on up, and at that time you could get a 1-week visa for Burma. And so I went in and really, again, had a great time. Rangoon, up to Inle, Taunggyi, across to Bagan, and back down to Rangoon in a week. And that was it, that was it. There was no extending, there was no anything. You had to leave and get a new visa and come back if that's what, if you wanted to spend more time. So it was also just extraordinary, quirky. I had some really amazing, interesting experiences that sort of started to open up for me. What is this place? This is a very, very unusual place.
Like what were those?
Well, a couple of things in Taunggyi, right? So I'm walking around Taunggyi, which was a very, very interesting place, and up at some elevation, so comfortable weather. There's a library there. So I say, okay, I'm going to go in there, and all the books in glass cases, and I'm going along and looking at the titles and all this sort of thing. And I saw some things that I was interested in looking at. So I went to the lovely, sweet, kind older lady who was at the desk, and I said, excuse me, would I be able to have a look at those? And she gives me a big smile and says, oh, I'm sorry. The man with the key is not here. And, where is the man with the key to the glass cases that allows people to access the books in the library? Oh, he's in Rangoon. And when might he be back? Oh, I don't know. All with a very friendly and big smile. So here was a library full of books that nobody had access to, right? And that was that was a good image. And then also in Taunggyi, it was, October, so you're still getting some rain. And I'm walking along and I hear this, "Hooray! Hooray!" And it turned out it was a schoolboy soccer game, football game. And so I went to watch that. My wife knows that if there's a soccer game, I'll watch it. And it was, the field was surrounded by a track, as is, very common. And part of it was flooded, the track part was flooded up to the knees, right? And so what would happen is the teams just over and over would intentionally kick the ball into the water. And that was when everybody went, hooray, because somebody had to go in there into the knee-deep water to go get the ball so that they could keep playing. And then the game kept going and devolved into a big brawl. and that was the end. And so to me, it was like, oh, this place is fun and interesting and different.
And so that 1982 visit, that led to further interest. You went to University of Michigan and you did your thesis on a subject related to Thailand and Burma, and presumably studied more on Southeast Asia. So talk about how your early academic career also started to tilt towards this part of the world.
Yeah, I think from my travel, I found mainland Southeast Asia to be just particularly fascinating. And here I am, 40 plus years later, increasingly living my life here with the intention of living here fully in my golden years, such as they are. I felt very at home here. It's kind of funny because Southeast Asian Buddhists have a very easy explanation. They just shrug and say, "Oh, well, you must have lived here in a previous life," and that so that explains it. And now we can move on to other things. But I just felt fascinated and comfortable here, and so mainland Southeast Asia was the area that I wanted to focus on. And of course, if you're going to be studying Thailand, you're going to do comparative work against Burma. And if you're looking at Burma, you're going to compare it to Thailand, geography, population, history, a lot of reasons that it's useful to be comparing the two. And so, yes, I ended up, at University of Michigan. They have an interdisciplinary master's program where you work with professors whose focus is Southeast Asia, but they might be in the sociology department or the history department or the economics department or whatever. But you can focus on Southeast Asia within that. And that was really an ideal program for me. And Victor Lieberman, the historian of Burma, was my professor. I ended up being a TA for him. And, I was just so grateful to come across these wonderful professors who could inspire me and help me understand what the opportunities were. And I met my wife while I was in grad school as well, so it was all a very good experience.
How would you describe what the Burma Studies field was then? It's certainly turned into something different now and continues to evolve, but how would you, going back, time traveling back to that place, how would you characterize what the Burma Studies field was like at that time?
Yeah, well, it was small. We can certainly begin with that. It was very small. It really was. I can remember there was some like a Fulbright opportunity, and they just described what they perceived to be the hardship level of going and doing field work, going and studying and living with your family in Burma. At that time. So it was, let's be real, it was difficult from the visa point of view, just difficult logistically. It was a hard place to live, pretty easy for people to fall prey to illness and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a very small world. And again, so I was very grateful to have Victor Lieberman, who I have the deepest respect for, a really wonderful man and a terrific scholar and a great lecturer, even though he didn't really like lecturing. He wanted just to research, but he was a great lecturer. So, what a blessing, what an opportunity for me. So yes, within a very small field, I had direct exposure to one of the real leading scholars. So yeah, in later years, I think it got the out of Northern Illinois University, it got a little controversial. It was sort of anti-political, which was a very difficult line to walk when you were dealing with Burma. But at that time, it wasn't that way in Burma studies in the early mid '80s. It was just a very limited. University of Michigan has one of the best libraries on Southeast Asia. Probably the three best collections in the United States are Library of Congress, Cornell University, and University of Michigan. Michigan had an open buying policy after World War II. If it was published, they bought it, right? So for a library nerd like myself, It was incredible. And so to the extent that these resources existed, they existed in Ann Arbor in that library. Yeah. So yes, it was a small field, but once you go into the library in the stacks, the good old fashioned way of just spending hours and, oh, I found this interesting book and only 3 books away is one that I hadn't even thought of. And, I spent many hours doing that. But Michigan was and still is, I think, a tremendous resource that way.
You reference going forward, looking at the relationship between academia and politics and some of the controversy there, and that segues into the next event that happened in the world and in your life, and this is, of course, 1988. To set the context, before 1988, it's interesting because 1988 is really seen as kind of the time that Burma appeared on the world stage. It was really so much of a forgotten country before that to many people. Your case being an exception. Your parents went there when you were young, so it was on your radar. You went there as a backpacker, and so then, and of course, studied it in school. So for you, you were one of the very few at that time that it was on the radar. You were very interested in it. It was something that you'd had varied experience before, but in 1988, it appears on the world scene, and everything, just hell breaks loose with it. To set the context internationally, this is, of course, Ne Win's coup is 1962. And at that time, it's you go back and you read the archives of the response to that coup. People in and outside the country didn't necessarily think it was all that bad of a thing. There's a lot of turmoil at the time. Didn't know what it would turn out to, and very soon Ne Win's disastrous Burmese way to socialism revealed what it was. But it was forgotten not just outside, but there are stories of when diplomats would come in the country, Ne Win wouldn't allow any of his staff or departments to talk to any diplomats. So it was very unusual. In diplomats, when they come to a place, they talk. That's what they do. And yet, even for those that were involved in Burma and came to Burma, they were not able to engage. So there was really quite a bit of quiet about what was going on there. And of course, 1988 is when, 88, 89, 90, 91, looking at world, this is when the Soviet Union collapses, the Berlin Wall, and so South Africa. So there's just this growing sense of freedom and transformation happening. And this also struck me when I was interviewing Matida and read her biography, her autobiography of that time. And she's describing the events in Burma as being a young activist in Burma at that time as not just related to Burma, but following the news all around the world and realizing we're a part of all of these countries that are now seeking their aspirations for freedom. It's really tragic to read that and think that so many of those other countries were able to make that jump and transition, and Burma is still locked in this cycle.
After I had left University of Michigan in '85, my then girlfriend, now wife, she was doing a PhD, which was a lot more difficult than doing the master's degree. And so she stayed on. I started a summer business out in Seattle, and that business would allow me to essentially travel all winter. I would work hard in the summer, and then I could travel in the winter. And I would write updates for a journal published out of Ann Arbor called Southeast Asia Business, usually about Thailand, because Thailand in the 80s was a very, very vibrant economy, and only occasionally about Burma, because Burma in the 80s was a moribund economy, and just as you were saying, not really interested in much engagement with the whole rest of the world, withdrew from the non-aligned movement, for instance. That's a real illustration. So I would travel, and I would come to Southeast Asia and hitchhike around, and spend several months, and it was really a great pleasure. And in the summer of 1988, my plan was to come to the region and just hop back and forth 7 days at a time, and spend a month or 6 weeks in Burma, as many times as they were willing to put that new visa stamp in my passport. I was going to go. And then, of course, in the summer of 1988, everything blew up, and the 4/8 date there in August. And at that time, to my knowledge, Mary Kay Magistad with National Public Radio was the news voice. I didn't subscribe to the New York Times. They were doing some about it, but the way I got my news about Burma was from Mary Kay Magistad, reporting, and it was very difficult to keep up. Kids these days have it so easy, you know how that line goes. But access to information was just a completely different world. So then, I wrapped up my summer business pretty darn close to September 18th. So it was obvious that I was not going to be able to take the trip that I had planned. And I ended up in the region here and, spent most of the time in Thailand on that trip. But it was distressing. Obviously, it was easy to get your hope up for something good to happen, and then it went so terribly wrong. So when I was here in the region, then there were Burmese flowing into the country, flowing into Thailand to escape the killings in Burma, and. At that point, I was not too politically focused. History and culture and economics was more what I was interested in. But things began to change at that point. And in subsequent years, it was people looking at it as a normal country, as a normal situation that I found offensive. And that's where I started to push back on it.
It's interesting you saying that, because there have been various people we've talked to on here about any number of things, from gender discrimination in Buddhism to some other social or political issue. And when they describe where their activism or advocacy kicked off, whatever word one wants to use, sometimes people will describe it as being like, look, I never meant to be an activist. How was I supposed to possibly manage and live when this was going on around me? This was happening to me or to my friends or to my community. This was the only response that made sense. And so I'm picking up from you at this time that as you were coming in with this academic and historical background and not really looking to make political waves, based on what was happening to this place that you cared about and had relations with, it propelled you into feeling that you had to do something. And so tell us what that thing was.
Well, I'll be honest, it took a couple of years. I was newly married, new homeowner in Seattle, was kind of focused on those sort of things. I had a business that I was building up at the time. And through that business, I took the Dale Carnegie class, and in fact, I enjoyed it a great deal. And at the end, you make a personal commitment to something. Doesn't matter, it's up to you. And so my personal commitment at that point was to do more volunteer work. Mm-hmm. I just said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And again, it wasn't what I wasn't really thinking about Burma at that point. Burma was something that was, inside me and that I was very frustrated about. But it wasn't front of mind per se. And so after I made that commitment, at that time, there were Tibetans being resettled. And so, I would go with them, take them to the county public health office and go through the process there and take them to get ID and, help them out that way. But I don't really have a background in Tibetan studies or I had been in Tibetan areas, both in Nepal and in China. But it wasn't the same. And then an author named Edith Mirante, and I don't know whether you've interviewed Edith, but I hope that that'll take place. She published a book called Burmese Looking Glass that still is very much worth reading, I would say, for anybody. And a friend of mine reviewed it for the Seattle Times and then gave me the review copy, so I read it. And it turned out that through somebody at University of Washington, I heard that Edith was coming to town, and I had a cup of tea with her. And she said, there's a movement, there's something happening, and you should be part of it. And she said, you should start a local group, just start it up. And so I did. And at that point, it was Pepsi. that had, Pepsi had gone in, and the red, white, and blue logo, and it's just sugar water. In my household, we call it sugar water, and we don't drink much soda pop, and so it was easy to boycott Pepsi because I wasn't buying it anyway. But again, it was just offensive to me that under the circumstances of death and torture and abuse of ethnic communities and on, that let's sit around and sell a bunch of Pepsi. It just didn't seem right. So I was keen to promote some awareness and against Pepsi's involvement in Burma, but I didn't have any network for distributing it. And Edith plugged me into the Free Burma Coalition that was just starting up. And she was a little bit of sort of Johnny Appleseed. She traveled all across the U.S. in the Greyhound buses and left groups behind. Groups started up. So one thing is I printed up tens of thousands of Boycott Pepsi stickers. I was involved in business where I knew that if they had an 800 number, and anytime somebody answers that 800 number, at this time it would cost $1 a minute, right? So by calling Pepsi and talking to their frontline people, you're creating a cost for them. And so, it was all fairly naive, but it was, as you said, it was just this desire to do something, to respond somehow. And so that was the one thing. And the other is I did start a group in Seattle that eventually we named the Seattle Burma Roundtable. And it met on a monthly basis for 23 years after that. And through that, I had many friendships and people kind of came out of the woodwork. In any community, there were a few people who knew about Burma, who cared about Burma. And if you created an opportunity for them to come together, they would. And so that's, so it sort of took place at two levels. On the one hand, nationally connecting with the Free Burma Coalition, and on the other hand, locally, just finding these people. And at that time, it was gather phone numbers, and then the few days before the meeting, just bang through and call everybody and say, the meeting's going to take place. This was, email existed, but it wasn't really heavily used, and certainly wasn't heavily used by me in the early 90s.
It's so interesting to hear this, because today, of course, the advocacy and activist groups that are really around the world, led by diaspora, exiles, as well as allies of Burma that are non-Burmese, there are roots, there are traditions, there's institutions. But you were really at the ground level of when the early iterations of this started to form into this whole infrastructure that we see now. So I think as part of the institutional history that we could say you lived and that you led, that you were involved in, I think it's really fascinating and important for us today that are continuing this effort to understand where it came from and the early grassroots of how this came. So I wonder if you can take us back and just describe something of the feeling or the context, the difficulties, the environment of what it was like to really, because you're bringing a message about a place that is a virtual unknown without the networks, without the past people and activities to draw upon. There's no roadmap for what you're doing. Everything you did turned into, in some way or another, branched out into other people carrying the torch into what we see today. But that early effort without the roadmap, that was something that you and Edith and Taunggyi and some other ones were taking off. So just describe something of what that was like to be to be kind of moving ahead as you're laying out the tracks.
Yeah, I credit Taunggyi with the vision for the slogan that we used at in those years was, "When spiders unite, they can tie down a lion," an Ethiopian proverb, I believe. And so that was, and he was at that time University of Wisconsin. He was using email, and this was the revelation, I think, once we could network internationally in real time, as opposed to sending letters and 2 weeks later and so on, is that we could take what is essentially a disadvantage, that there are not that many people who know what the heck about Burma, or let alone care. But we could network all the ones who do, and suddenly we looked like something significant. We looked like a movement, which, in any single place, we really kind of did not. So it was the technology was absolutely critical for allowing us to work together remotely. And again, that doesn't sound like anything these days, but it really was a revelation and a really big change. When we were first meeting as the Seattle Burma Roundtable, I happened to know a gal. At that time, Thai Airways flew in and out of Seattle. Seattle and Dallas were the cities. And I knew a Thai gal who worked in the first class lounge at SeaTac Airport for Thai Airways. And I asked her, can you just stack up the Bangkok Post and Nation and I'll come get them? And so then I would have all these, newspapers, and with either I would clip them or just pass the newspapers around to the group. This is how we're getting information to one another.
Yeah.
And we had Burmese students from University of Washington who would come and participate, and they would have information that they got from those $2 a minute phone calls that they, that's what it cost, $3 a minute back in the day. They would share information, but they were also very eager to see, what was being published in the Thai newspapers. So yeah, it was it was a moment of transition because it was the beginning of internet-based activism, and the internet is an extraordinary tool for organizing. And I think Far Eastern Economic Review did do an article, Dateline DC, that called Free Burma Coalition the first internet-based activist movement, which maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but at least in print in the hallowed Far Eastern Economic Review, at least they said so.
It's incredible to think that, and really we do have to go back and remember what a massive innovation that email was, and we all take for granted now. I was reading an article the other day about, it was some anniversary of the, maybe 100-year anniversary of the advent of the microphone, and it was this whole discussion going back to the archives of how the invention of the microphone just changed human society completely. Because what you could do with amplifying your voice, with being able to capture different voice qualities and not having to speak in volume, to be able to speak in lower voices, and what it did for musicians, that their range could be captured more. And so it just, you take these technologies for granted in such a way that you have to put yourself back there and remember what life would be like without this thing at all. And that's where, so this Burma advocacy happening post 88 is coinciding with internet starting to take off. Not take off enough that everyone quite knows what it is or knows how to do it, but you have enough, it sounds like Maung Zarni, maybe some others, enough of people that were just ahead of the curve to say, hey, this new technology here, if we get everyone on it, we could use it this way and that. And I also appreciate what you said, that it gave your movement the sense of being greater than it was. Optics are very important. This is an information war. And how you present yourself and how you come off is as or more important than sometimes the actual substance and reality behind it, because these, one feeds into the other. But this part, this emergence is talking more about the connection to the technology and and how you're making use of the technical improvements at the time. I'm also interested in the narrative that you're making. That when one thinks about Burma advocacy, first and foremost, narrative is what comes to mind, because the narrative has been so kind of captured and even, I would say, held hostage in some ways to certain ideas that then have trapped a more nuanced and deeper understanding. And yet you also have to have a narrative that catches fire and takes off. And we can come later to a question of what is the narrative now, because that comes to be a very problematic and challenging, complex way to look at what is the narrative that we're presenting and sharing, and how are people understanding it now. But again, because you were on the ground level, you were co-creating the narrative that would take off when there was no narrative before. This was a dark spot. This is something that no one really knew anything about. So you were constructing, really, we can say, one of the first narratives that would come to be about Burma, and you were doing it. So on one hand, you're constructing the narrative of advocacy about Burma to want it to catch fire and people to take hold. But then you're also doing that in concert with what was happening in the world at that time, with globalization and with social justice and other countries that were also trying to achieve their freedom in the 1990s. And so if you could also talk about, as far as you remember, the thoughts around what kind of narrative you were trying to create and what that early creation was like.
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is very, very important. There's some old cliche about after you've been in some place for a week, you know all about it, and after a month you begin to have doubts, and after a year you realize you don't know anything.
Right.
And Burma is an incredibly complex place, and that doesn't particularly serve you well when you are engaged in advocacy. To the extent possible, you want a simple, clean, black and white narrative. Most issues are not particularly black and white, and I think Burma is an example of a highly complex place where black and white are kind of hard to find. So yes, we did to the extent we could really describe it in as black and white a manner as possible. Look, you had the May 1990 elections, 82% of the seats won by the NLD. You didn't have that in South Africa. You didn't have that in Cuba. You didn't have that in a lot of the places that that were also being talked about at the time. You had a national exercise where people, given the opportunity in a remarkably free and fair election, the exercise itself, they stated their case. And so, yes, to the extent we could, we kept it simple, and we kept it as close to black and white. Of course, you had the beautiful and well-spoken Aung San Suu Kyi, and you had the, grumpy and uncommunicative and murderous military. It wasn't that hard to sharpen the lines a little bit between the two. And, I've been in enough meetings in congressional offices that when you begin to describe nuance, that's when the blackberries come out and people, you simply lose them. And so, if you don't want to lose them, you got to keep it simple. And does that mean you cut some corners here and there? I think, yes, there's no, I plead guilty. But it was necessary under the circumstances.
That's where it gets so interesting, because any story you tell, you have to take a narrative, and a narrative is simply a cherry picking of facts and arranging them in a certain order to give a certain story that has resonance. We do that with everything. Without narrative, they're just facts that are floating around that don't make sense. So you need to find some way to tie them down. And as you say, I understand completely. When you start to get into that nuance, people's eyes do start to glaze. And the narrative that you were able to tell, as you laid out Aung San Suu Kyi, the 1990 elections, the murderous generals, the serenity of the Buddhist monks, etc., all of these things are just selling themselves. So as you're going back there in time and describing how you'd have to sharpen some of the edges and find ways to take these truths and put them together to make them yet more compelling, all of this makes sense. And yet if we jump forward, we then run into a problem, because then the simplicity of the narrative breaks down. The nuance that the activists weren't mentioning because they wanted to make it simple, and that the people weren't paying attention to because they had short attention spans, that nuance broke down the illusion of what that compelling black and white narrative was, and then it left a lot of people really confused and tense and such. And so where do you see that relationship? I don't know what could have been done differently before, because it was a movement that did catch fire in such a way, and yet it then broke down almost baked into the cake, those elements which made it catch fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we sit here in 2025, we're probably still suffering from the breakdown of a simplistic narrative and the realization that it's, in the wider community, that it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And but the problem is sometimes, often, people simply turn away. Yeah. Oh, it's complicated. Then I got other things to do. My life's complicated already. I understand that, and but I think that that's part of the situation that we find ourselves in right now, where the world is simply not paying attention to this. Is that that people are saying, oh, it turned out to be more complicated than I thought it was, and I didn't have the bandwidth to do the deep dive, so never mind. I think there's, I think we are kind of caught in that. But yeah, if you go back to, what was on our plate was that the NLD had kind of self-consciously patterned itself after the anti-apartheid struggle. Aung San Suu Kyi, in a very straightforward manner, said if you do business under current circumstances in Burma, then you directly benefit the military, and therefore you should not do so. And for an anti-authoritarian personality like mine, that was an opportunity and some marching orders to boycott these companies and get them to stop doing business in a manner that Aung San Suu Kyi, the winner of the May 1990 elections, says harms the people of Burma. We don't want that, so okay. So that's what, that was sort of the organizing principle of the Free Burma Coalition, was to follow on, kind of two tracks. One was boycotts of companies with the ultimate goal of Unocal and the Yadana pipeline project. And on the other hand, selective contracting laws that again had been used to substantial effect during the anti-apartheid struggle, where municipalities, counties, states would say, more or less, under equal circumstances, we're going to do business with a company not doing business in South Africa, or we're going to do business with a company not doing business in Burma. So these were kind of the two tracks: the boycotts and the selective contracting laws. And it happened that Eddie Bauer, which is a Seattle area-based company, I don't know, maybe they've been bought and sold and their headquarters is not there anymore, but their flagship store was right in the heart of downtown, very easy to go leaflet and say these clothes are being manufactured in a military-owned factory. And which they said, no, it isn't. And I said, yes, it is. We just went back and forth on that. But we had, there was a young woman named Brenda Belak who had just spent a couple of years on the border, and very charismatic young woman. And she had a lot of free time, and she'd just go down there and leaflet. She knew exactly what she was talking about. The situation for the Karen, for instance. And how annoying to, for Eddie Bauer. Then I had spent whatever, $1,200 buying a programmable fax machine, right? Again, this is, again, the sort of the technology side, so that I could program in numbers. And eventually I got lots of numbers of various faxes at Eddie Bauer headquarters. And I would just, whenever the military did something, I'd write on there, this is what your business partner just got up to, this is Eddie Bauer manufacturing military-owned factory in Burma, and send it to 20 desks inside the headquarters. So, and then we had a visit from Mairead Corrigan Maguire, the Nobel Peace Laureate from Northern Ireland from 1976, wonderful lady. And Seattle doesn't have a huge Irish community. It's not like Chicago or New York or Boston. And so she had some free time when she came to Seattle. And so I got to take her out to dinner I then brought her back to my house and met the Seattle Burma Roundtable folks. And then the next day, we went and met the mayor and the city council, and they all said, "Oh, we feel very strongly, about Burma," because she was doing Burma advocacy. She was part of the trip that was here, met with the Thai king, and advocated for Aung San Suu Kyi's freedom. Right. So she's a great lady, and I it may be appropriate to have a story in there from that dinner. But anyway, she was she spoke to a high-powered group of women, business women in Seattle. And she contacted Eddie Bauer and said, "Tomorrow I'm going to talk to those women, and I'm going to tell them what you're doing, and urge you to stop manufacturing a military-owned factory." And Eddie Bauer responded very quickly and said, "We've decided on our own, unrelated to anything else going on, that we're going to leave Burma." And so that was the first boycott that succeeded.
It's fascinating to go back there and to get that history. And of course, what you're talking about has resonance and relevance with everything happening today. And ever since, these cycles just keep repeating themselves here. And we can have the same conversation, which I think we will a little bit later on, about this whole notion of responsible business today and during the transition and such. But just staying on your advocacy at the time, because the two biggest projects that you were involved in, we haven't gotten to yet. We're building to that, from Pepsi to Eddie Bauer, and then moving on to Unocal and to Yadana. So tell us about what was going on with these two large corporations and what your involvement was.
So yeah, I had met some guys in Seattle. They were Vietnam vets. They had been providing relief supplies to Laos. And one time they were not able to get their supplies into Laos, but they had all these supplies here in Thailand. I was like, what do we do with them? And they were introduced to the Karen. And so they developed a relationship over there. And they had this was at an old boat repair business down at the water. And they would take Karen Human Rights Group reports. Awesome group, Karen Human Rights Group, right? And they would photocopy them, just masses. You'd go in the room and it was just stacked high with all these reports. And they would send them to Geneva, and they would send them to London, and they would send them to New York and DC and so on. Like, they would do it to the point of spending all their money just to try to build awareness. Yeah. And these Karen Human Rights Group reports, for people who are not familiar, were really very fact-focused. Where did this take place? What was the date? Who was the battalion? Who was the commanding officer? Who were the victims? And what's the story, right? It was really, really, they had a real good framework about it. And you could basically, reach in to the middle of a stack, pull out a report, open it up to the middle, and be horrified. Horrifying, one thing after another, after another, after another. And some of these reports started to come from Tendon 3, from the Yadana area, where they were looking to build this natural gas pipeline to Thailand. And so, that was, first of all, from a revenue point of view, the amount of money that they make from Pepsi and taxes or whatever was minimal. But, in the case of natural gas revenues, a big fat check is cut to the dictator, and he can do whatever he wants with it. And so this is obviously the thing that that needs to be focused on.
And this is 1.2 billion, right?
Right, yeah. Right. So it was a big project, and stood to provide an enormous amount of revenue, which it has during its lifetime. It's coming toward the end of the life of that field, of the gas field. But yes, so it became very clear that this was our ultimate goal. And, whatever, Levi Strauss, they decided not to go on their own. Pepsi, eventually, the local partner, stood up at some big rally and called for the annihilation of the internal and external destructionists, which meant the NLD, and that I knew was the end for them, because Pepsi itself couldn't be seen calling for the annihilation of anybody in particular. And it was a little ironic because during the Pepsi boycott, it was super easy to organize university students because every university typically has a contract with Pepsi or Coke. And those come up for renegotiation. And so, we had Harvard, we had Stanford, we had Princeton, we had all these top university groups advocating against Pepsi. And when we had our national meeting in Washington, D.C., we had hundreds of people there, And after Pepsi pulled out, it was more difficult to organize. It's ironic sometimes not winning helps the movement, but because once we won, then things went a lot quieter on university campuses.
Right. Yeah. You need something to agitate against, right?
Right. And Pepsi was just so, it's just, you see it everywhere when you're on a university campus, So yeah, it was a funny thing, but just generally, we started to announce a boycott the next day that the company would withdraw. It just became like that. And it was the same, I think, I don't remember the name of the company. It was an LA-based company. I think we got 3 people to go there with signs, and we did the press release that we would send all over the world. And somebody, would pick it up. Oftentimes, the wire services that were based here in Bangkok would pick it up, so we won that boycott in one day with 3 people. Most people won't know Bullwinkle Moose, the cartoon on TV, but there was a character in Bullwinkle. The scariest guy of all was named Mr. Big. And Mr. Big was actually this tiny guy, but he would always have a flashlight next to him and portray a big shadow on the wall. And what you really saw was the big shadow on the wall. That was us.
Optics again,
That
right?
was us, yes. Yeah. We're actually very small, and we want to look as big as possible. Because my wife is Thai, and we would come here in the summertime. She taught at University of Washington, and in the summer, then she was free. We'd come over here. I would go to the Bangkok Post Office or to the AP office, Dennis Gray and all that. And I could sit down with people. And because my background, involved some study of Burma, and it wasn't just I was some young, passionate person, when I sent them a press release later, then they would take it more seriously because they knew me, and they knew that this guy knows something of what he's talking about, and not everybody in that movement is just a wide-eyed activist who glommed down to this issue and not some other one. So I sort of became the press officer for Free Burma Coalition, especially in the mid to late 90s.
It's interesting because, again, as we are building the early stages of this movement and talking about how you use the technology and how you built the narrative, and now you're talking about kind of how you built the infrastructure and how you develop the relationships, the amplification of the message, the making yourselves bigger than you were, the network of reaching out, what you repair. So this is all step by step. You're laying out how this started to form, and of course, again, fast forwarding into what we see today, where these networks are much more well established, and while they also are reinventing themselves and new players and voices are getting on the scene. But it's interesting to go back in time and just see where this emerged from. And I came across an article preparing for this, Jeff Shaw out of Burma, and he referenced the work that you were doing in the 1990s and early 2000s. He called it the, quote, the most powerful boycott and divestment campaign since the anti-apartheid effort of the 1980s. So this focus that you're having on divestment in Burma is on this particular issue. It's becoming the way that you're using email, as well as the way that you're encouraging divestment. This is taking on a prominence above and beyond any advocacy for any other issue out there at the time. I mean, that's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It was kind of remarkable because there's a natural constituency for the anti-apartheid struggle outside of South Africa because it was a racial issue, but there wasn't much of a natural constituency for Burma outside. So the fact that we could look anything like the anti-apartheid struggle internationally,
right?
We should feel proud of that. It's kind of a that was a challenge, and I think this small group of folks rose to the challenge. And so with Unocal, then we started to go to the belly of the beast. Right at that point, they were headquartered in El Segundo. There was a good group of people in Los Angeles, a roundtable there. Louisa Benson Craig lived in Los Angeles. If anybody's familiar with the book Miss Burma, that's about Louisa. And she was 2 times Miss Burma. She was a movie star. She was chased down by Ne Win. She became a Karen rebel commander. Just an amazing person. And later did peace studies at Columbia University and was an embodiment of personal peace. She was really a very inspiring person. So they were engaged with Unocal and having meetings and all that. And I started going to the annual meeting of shareholders, the owners of the company, to bring this issue in front of the shareholders in a way that, the management, of course, wants to keep this sort of information away from shareholders. And so these were very divisive meetings and yelling but to a certain extent, that's what we were trying to accomplish, is bring some emotion into this. People feel real strongly about what's going on, and we want everybody in this room to feel it, right? Feel that. And Father Joe Lamar from the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, he passed away in the last year. May he rest in peace. A wonderful man. He really understood the power of the shareholder meeting and introduced me to that, and I ended up doing a lot of that in my day-to-day work for a number of years after. So yeah, we'd go to the annual meeting. So, I sat next to Joe Lamar one time, and an elderly guy spent the entire time kicking the back of his chair at the shareholders meeting. This is the most juvenile thing you could possibly imagine. But that it was don't tell me. I don't want to hear about this. Wow. I don't want to think about this. I don't want to. You're bothering me by confronting me with what my investments are doing. And yeah, so it was really interesting. It was valuable, and that's a tough nut to crack. That one is a tough nut to crack. There's some, somebody's famous quote that maybe it's Will Rogers. Real hard to get a guy to understand something that costs him money, that hurts him in the wallet, and yeah, because they didn't want to understand. And that's there's a film called Total Denial that you can find on YouTube, and I would recommend everybody to watch it. That looks at the whole Doe versus Unocal lawsuit, and how that came about. But it gives you a lot of background on the Yadana project, and it was severe. It was really a harmful project. And I will point out that there was only one private company in the United States that provided financial, diplomatic, political support to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that one company was Unocal. So they were willing to do business in places that others weren't. And that's, they were the bottom feeders.
Right. And another act of creative resistance in approaching Unocal, in addition to this shareholder activism, is what's called plaintiff's democracy, the Alien Tort Claims Act. So tell us what that was about.
Yeah, Alien Tort Claims Act, the 1789 law that essentially says, provides some level of extraterritoriality so that violations of the law of nations that take place abroad can, under certain circumstances, be dealt with in U.S. courts. And so it was fairly moribund, been used against torturers who had done torture in Chile or in other countries. Now we're in the United States, they had used that. Katie Redford, who was doing a law degree at Columbia University, wrote a paper saying this could be used in corporate accountability cases. And I'm led to believe that her professor was Taft, who later was the solicitor of the United States. And he said, no, this will never work, and you get an A, right? It was an excellent paper, but it'll never work. But she was married to Kasawa, Karen, who a very, very brave man who would go inside and gather the testimonies, always carrying a single-shot pistol with him so that he could kill himself, because he knew that if he was captured, he would be tortured to death and probably give up names. And so he always had that gun. So that's her husband. So, she gathered together a team, and they did file this Doe versus Unocal case. Over the years, it's sort of been picked apart so that the Alien Tort Claims Act, I think, is not as influential as it was. Companies are very, 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 very intimidated by it. And they've been able to chip away at its reach a little bit. But this was, it was a groundbreaking case. And I think, if I were a young law school student, I would look very closely at this one. I think there's still opportunities to hold people accountable for their activities wherever they are.
Mm-hmm. And so this is what allows villagers to directly seek out claims against the damage that was done to them by those companies. So villages that were burned down, displaced, forced labor, and then the rape, murder, torture, all those things that happened in the process of laying this and maintaining this pipeline.
Yes, and right down to a baby being kicked into a fire and subsequently dying a couple days later. So yeah, just really, really bad. And Louisa Benson Craig was the extra plaintiff in that case. She's ethnic Karen and had some connection to it. But yeah, it was mostly these 13 villagers who brought it. So it was not a class action. Mm-hmm. It was just a group. And in the end, it was settled just a couple of weeks before Unocal was acquired by Chevron. And so I'm pretty sure that Chevron had said, we need to clear the decks, mm-hmm. For this purchase to go through. That's going to make all you guys in the top suite at Unocal very, very wealthy. You need to settle this thing. And so they did settle it. Business Week reported it at $30 million, which I think it was $1.5 billion or something like that, mm-hmm. was the sale. So it's relatively insignificant, but for the plaintiffs, mm-hmm. It was not insignificant. And it was important that the word compensation was used in the agreement, mm-hmm. that this was compensatory for harm that they had suffered.
So when you're looking at the real success you had with divestment across the 90s and 2000s and being able to just get company after company to leave, and you talk about you had such a system down that sometimes you just show up with 3 protesters right. and a piece of paper, and they run away terrified, wanting to make it go away. But then you go to the belly of the beast, and this is a real battle. This is something. This is not as easy as these other companies that you're just trying to get out of there. So how, looking back at the long term, how would you describe the success of your engagement with battling this belly of the beast?
Yeah, maybe it's the miseducation of Larry Dohrs. There were so many things that came along that I didn't realize had been put in place in order to promote and protect the rights of these companies to pursue profit. and not very many things put in place to protect and promote human rights. When we were doing these selective contracting laws, it came up that there's a government procurement agreement within the sort of WTO structure that says local, municipal, county governments are not allowed to use non-economic criteria when making purchasing decisions. So, and who defines non-economic criteria? They do. And so, if I say I would prefer in the city of Seattle that my dollars not go to companies doing business in Burma, that's perceived as non-economic criteria, and therefore it's banned. It's not allowed, And the way that Seattle was made to be subject to this was by the governor not objecting to the government procurement agreement. So there was just a passive thing. Nobody actually did anything about it, and suddenly Seattle is subject to this restriction. So yeah, we're discovering all these things. And the WTO at that time, Burma was a member in good standing. And at the same time, you had the ILO saying that there was widespread and systematic forced labor. So how do you have an economy with widespread and systematic forced labor being a member in good standing of a trade body?
Doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make sense. Why should a worker in Thailand, or let alone the United States, have to compete with forced labor from a member in good standing? So it was discovering, for me, discovering all these tools that benefited them and how difficult it was. And I'll just say, in New York, the selective contracting law passed 50-0. Rudy Giuliani signed it with a flourish. As well he might when it passed 50-0. There's not a lot else you can do. Los Angeles, it passed unanimously, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The one city where it came to a full vote and it did not pass was Seattle. And I put a lot of time and effort into that after Mairead Maguire had come and she'd kicked off that effort. And a couple of years later, it failed by one vote. The ironic thing is the people, essentially the Washington Council on International Trade, the trade lobby, local trade lobby organization, turned around to the WTO and said, see, we are the most trade-friendly city in the United States. We should host the WTO. And so the 1999 WTO meeting came to Seattle. I was on the original host committee, for the community host committee for that. And, and it was an opportunity for us, but for lots of other people on lots of other issues to begin to challenge this rulemaking that has been taking place out of sight and that affects all of us. So yeah, it was all this, again, I had no intention of becoming, involved with the WTO. I had no idea whatsoever. But by default, if you want to achieve the more direct goal in front of you to try to help justice and democracy in Burma, you got to deal with the WTO. Who would have thought? I didn't.
Right. So this WTO in Seattle, this becomes infamous for the reaction and the resistance that happens. That's known by pretty much anyone who was around at the time. What I didn't know was that you were that your group was using the concerns about globalization, tapping into those concerns to address the human rights abuses and forced labor in Burma. So this was a piece of information that was new to me. Tell us how you were fitting that Burma piece into the wider WTO, the resistance to WTO, and the whole conflict that happened during that time when it was hosted in Seattle.
Yeah, I think, generally the point that I would make, and I think it ended up in Time magazine, is that strong majorities of Americans would prefer to see environmental and labor protections in trade agreements. And yet they never end up there. So there's this disconnect between what citizens want and what citizens get through these relatively unaccountable organizations. The U.S. trade rep is the person who liaising with the WTO, and somehow what the people want never gets there, right? So that was, there's a rule-making body, and we as a community have objections to some of these rules. And then let's just use Burma as an example. So that was kind of how we got there, because the forced labor thing, the ILO was at that time, was very, very blunt about it. And so, this whole thing of how is this a member in good standing? How is there no mechanism to suspend them or to punish them within, let alone to expel them? There's basically, they don't even have the mechanisms to do it, even if they wanted to, which they don't. So, it was, that's the way that at least I myself would approach it. And I can remember, got invited to some Econ 101 class at the University of Washington, 500 students in the big theater. And the professor really wanted me to be a rabid anti-trade, da-da-da-da-da type. And I went in there with a suit on and said, no, same thing, rule-making body. We have objections about the rules. We find that it's very difficult to have our voice heard when it comes to the rules being made at the WTO. And so we're trying to find ways to have our voice heard, and it seemed to me, fairly reasonable.
So then after the WTO, several years later, you were involved in the founding of the U.S. Campaign for Burma. This is another advocacy group, big advocacy group that gets kicked off the ground. Did this come off the heels of Free Burma Coalition? Was there some relationship there? And tell us about that start.
Yeah, so the Free Burma Coalition was, we tongue-in-cheek kind of called it the anti-organization. There was no board of directors, there was no incorporation, there was no bank account, there were no resources to fight over, which is sometimes, that's not a bad thing. When there are no resources, either you're in because you want to be, or you're out because you don't want to be. But it's got nothing to do with who gets what, because there isn't anything, right? So Free Burma Coalition thrived, I think, being an anti-organization, but at some point we were, big enough and institutionalized enough that we did need some structure. And at that time, Zarni, who is a mercurial personality, I love the guy, but he can change on a dime. And he had the idea of sort of changing by 180 degrees, and started negotiating with the Kenyan faction, and which was not something that the rest of us were prepared to do. And he kind of said, "Now we're going to do this," and the rest of us basically said, "No, we're not there. We don't think that that's the right approach." And especially when you refer back to the May 1990 elections and the NLD position and all that. So he kind of went his way, and at that point we said, well, we need a board of directors and a structure and all that kind of thing. And so U.S. Campaign was founded by almost everybody from the Free Burma Coalition, and it became a very very organized group. And at that time, the Open Society Institute was able to provide funding for our activities, and we got funding elsewhere, but that was a major funder. And we had really good people in Washington D.C. And in D.C. it's really important to understand efficient use of resources, and where who do you need? Well, you need the chair of that committee. Well, who's the staffer on that? That's the kind of thing. And the folks that we had in DC were very, very skilled at that. And so, we were kind of on top of our game in probably the first decade there of the 2000s.
It sounds like you're just really, from the time of 1988, just these are moves that you're continuing to scale up, know the landscape better, become something of a professional activist of knowing the grounds, even though you hadn't intended to fall into that category, that you just kept learning how to do things better and more systematically and with more structure?
Yeah, I think that's true, and again, without intention, without a plan, without you could not have, I don't think, have made a roadmap and then simply followed it. You just had to respond to, sometimes it was putting out fires, and sometimes it was grasping opportunities. But yeah, it was mostly a matter of being open and aware, and ready to respond.
And now you're challenging some pretty powerful and dark people and institutions. Did you ever feel that you personally were in danger or have any threats against yourself?
No, I did not, and that's something that I very much do appreciate, because yeah, these big oil companies, these resource extraction companies, can be very dangerous. They are very dangerous to a lot of people on the ground. But I never felt in any danger. Occasionally, people would tell me they were going to sue me, but nobody ever did. So I didn't fear. And even I was I went to Rangoon in 1996, and at that time, I used a little hook and crook to get the visa. And was able to have a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi at her place, and then the next day watch her speak over the fence, and saw the beautiful communication back and forth that she had, and the level of charisma that she had. It was just extraordinary. And even on that trip, I did not, at that time, the military intelligence, typically the guy with these mirrored shades would sit at the tea shop right across from you and stare at you, and and so they were just simply making it obvious, we are watching the heck out of you. And it's not like I had training in spycraft or anything, but I did my best just to see to what extent I was being monitored, and it was even then, because they were focused on Burmese. They were not that focused on foreigners at that time. So yeah, I never did.
Right. So let's move now into the transition period. This is when Burma's semi-civilian government takes power, and NLD is elected. Aung San Suu Kyi has some nominal rule, and at that time, you came out to caution against the lifting of sanctions. You called attention to the 2008 Constitution. The military was still a powerful institution. Human rights violations by armed forces were still continuing unabated, and there were ongoing wars in ethnic areas, exploitation of resources, and in your argument, you felt that prematurely lifting those sanctions would be associated with rewarding Aung San Suu Kyi from incomplete reform, because she's now in a position of change maker, even though she doesn't have full control. That the argument is that she could be doing something, and so this is a hot debate in the transition period. We've spoken to people, dozens of people on both sides of this argument, putting forth their rationales of why lifting sanctions, keeping them in place, or doing some kind of targeted approach was the right one. It's something that I think has still not been worked out. But let's hear your argument and your take as to what you felt about sanctions and engagement at this time.
Yeah, it was. It's interesting because I was not a fan of George W. Bush as a U.S. president generally. But on Burma, by golly, he was pretty good. And I was a big fan of Barack Obama as a president of the United States. And on Burma, they kind of glommed onto this idea that this is their big foreign policy success. And there simply was no room for any narrative that did not agree with that. And so anything negative, hey, there's still, look what just took place in Karen State, look what's going on, in Shan, and all this. They didn't want to hear it. It was not allowed to be discussed. And so if that's going to be the environment, then it's probably relatively easy for them to make the decision that, hey, now, this is our foreign policy success. And so holding back some sanctions maybe is inconsistent with this. The key message is this is our foreign policy success. And so, it was a little bit hopeless to try to influence that. It was my understanding at that time that Aung San Suu Kyi herself wanted a more structured removal, and with some goalposts. Well, if you reach this, then another sanction comes off. But instead, again, in order to be consistent with this narrative that this is our foreign policy success, everything had to go. And it did seem as though it was giving up the remaining leverage. But on reflection, when you look at that period, however you want to time it, 2012 to 2021, a lot was accomplished. I think the resistance that exists now only exists because of that time period and people connecting to the whole rest of the world, feeling part of the rest of the world. And they were not willing to go back after the coup in 2021. So, I'm not sure on reflection that it was terribly wrong. Because it was very important to achieve that period. But that's somebody's PhD thesis out there to discuss that one.
It's a lot of PhD thesis out there. And I want to, I've spoken to, as I mentioned, I've spoken to many people on both sides of the issue. And of the people on the side of engagement, we've had folks on the podcast that have come from a background of U.S. Embassy and foreign policy, from World Bank, from NLD leadership. And the argument, if I can put into a sentence somewhat of the argument that they made, it was that they will all say, the first sentence they will say was that we never intended to suggest that things were all right. We knew how wrong things were. That was never something that we were that we were avoiding or trying to ignore. The belief was that if we could engage in a careful, structured way to the point that engagement, society would move to a certain point that you couldn't then go back. That was our hope, knowing how imperfect it was and all these concerns we had. That was the best decision within the system that we could see to make in a field of not very good decisions, knowing how tenuous and how delicate it all was as we were doing it. And then so that would be an argument for it. The pushback that I've heard from some of these guests have been towards the activist community has been framing sanctions and more and a lack of engagement from the U.S. as being something that might morally feel good. It might have a good feeling from that you're standing up for right, and that it makes you feel like you're doing something. But in the end, how effective is it really? And this is kind of evaluating the difference between the long-term goals that you're aiming for, assuming that these are good actors that are intending for outcomes that we all share, balancing that with how good does it feel to just do something in the moment that might not then lead to where you want to go. This has been some of the criticism and pushback that I've heard from those interviews. So I'd be interested to hear what your response would be to these two arguments.
Yeah, I think, first of all, on the, yes, there was an understanding that is much more complex and we're not there yet and so forth. My sense is that similarly to my accepting the reality that we on the activist side occasionally painted things more black and white than they might actually have been, that these same people downplayed, they're I think probably in their mind they saw the complexities, but it didn't come out of their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
The mouth was, this is the great foreign policy success of the Obama administration. And so I don't think that they were as willing in public to acknowledge that, this is going to be complex. So,
right.
On the engagement side, Scott Marciel, who I have a lot of respect for, was an ambassador to Myanmar, Burma, because he was representing State Department and they still use Burma. He says yeah, I'm all for engagement. This is my whole career. This is my whole career is engaging. Unfortunately, the other side here is not amenable to engagement. There's no purpose to engagement. You don't accomplish anything with engagement. And, so he's a professional diplomat with a lot more experience and a lot of experience in Southeast Asia. And I tend to agree is that engagement, what's the old North Vietnamese, talk and fight, fight and talk, right? That's the purpose of engagement from the Burmese military side, is to slow down whatever adversarial behavior is going on in the international community, domestically. That's the point of engagement, is to slow your enemy. And meanwhile, you do whatever the heck you were going to do anyway, and they're not a sincere partner in engagement. And I would challenge people to show me where they actually are. And yes, you can find little, very small things, but fundamentally, when it comes to, sort of Burman chauvinism, Burma army chauvinism, we know and you don't, and that's that. I think they don't have a lot of room for compromise, and if you're not prepared to compromise, I'm not sure what's the purpose of engagement. So, again, yes, these are not easy questions. And I think anybody who presents them as easy questions, those activists didn't know what they were talking about, or, these diplomats, all they ever do is talk and they don't actually care. They're just trying to collect their salaries and their retirement and blah, blah, blah. Neither of those polarities are truly accurate. So I don't think it's a simple, it's not a simple answer. I think that a somewhat staged, stage by stage by stage, removal of sanctions would have been better, would have been a little more productive. But all in all, again, you look at what we got, and what we got was far from perfect, but such an improvement, an extraordinary transformation of life and society inside Burma. And so I'm not going to complain too much.
Right. I in my interview with Derek Mitchell, who was the ambassador from 2012 to 2016, when these pivotal decisions were being made, he did reference how he referenced his skepticism and his and the careful way of looking at not what they were saying, but what they were actually doing, and feeling, quarter by quarter, year by year, increasingly more confident that they were actually doing the things that were being required. And he was gaining confidence in their sincerity to respond tit for tat, and goes through, in the interview, goes through the release of political prisoners and some of the other things that they were looking for, and they were done. This was done. And so cautiously they were starting to engage little by little, and that led to the pivotal moment, which I know is very controversial. I've heard many different takes on this moment. I think this is a whole thesis, a series of podcast conversation itself. I've heard things that have been said to me as confidential that haven't come out in their clarity yet. This moment of all sanctions being lifted, that's the moment where I think that there are very different takes on this story, and there are things that have not come to light exactly on what was happening, particularly Aung San Suu Kyi's decision on that. There have been versions of stories I've heard that she was kind of hoodwinked or tricked into a description of what that lifting of sanctions would mean, that she was kind of bullied into going along with it. I've heard other versions that she felt that this was the time that they really did need to be lifted, because how could you run a country how could you show to the world and show to the country itself that you're that you really are open for business and moving ahead if you have all these restrictions in place? So where these two versions come together, I don't know, but at least up until that moment, I did, to at least in his telling of it, heard how American policy at that time leading into 2016 was trying this tit-for-tat approach.
Yeah, and I think the version that I've heard more often, have heard more often is the former, that she was given a single choice that she could either agree with or disagree with, but this was what was going to happen. But I'm not in a position to say that that's the truth. I just don't know. And I'm not sure that we will ever know. I hope that she has the opportunity to describe it publicly before her time passes. But I'm not, I'm not sure that we're going to get that. That's a real, a real tough one. But I do, I respect Eric Mitchell a great deal, and Scott Marcial, as I mentioned. But I kind of feel like at the Hillary Clinton, Kurt Campbell level, they were making their decisions and they didn't really care too much about any evidence to the contrary. They weren't very interested.
You think they just wanted the win?
I think they just wanted the win. And again, because they're operating, Derek Mitchell knows all about Burma. Scott Marcial knows all about Burma. Hillary Clinton doesn't. And I wonder about Kurt Campbell as well, to be honest. He's been in that position for a long time. He knows a lot about Asia. I'm not sure how much he knows about mainland Southeast Asia.
I think stepping back a moment on this dynamic as well, it's an interesting contrast, this inside-outside dynamic, and you touched upon this before a bit in your response, this question of those that choose to work within the system. They can't just do whatever they want. They can't do what feels good. They can't satisfy all groups at once. They sometimes have to make hard decisions where there's no good option on the board, and they just have to figure out how to proceed anyway while they have minimal change within the system, and they get heavy criticism and pressure from those outside who have these demands of things that they see that are right and wrong, and they just want something done a certain way and maybe don't understand the complexity of it. On the other hand, that's one way of looking at that might be more favorable, optimistic outlook for those that are trying to make change within. On the other hand, there are numerous examples of how outside groups will bring pressure and awareness to change that, yes, it is uncomfortable. It is inconvenient. Civil rights was really inconvenient. A lot of these freedoms that have happened, they were really awkward and uncomfortable to have to push and achieve, but the pressure became so much that those that were in positions of authority eventually had to listen to them, and they eventually had to say, okay, well, I think this is I'm gonna have to take some political capital to do this. It's gonna be really hard, but it's not just a function of being comfortable in a system and working. It's also that kind of awkward pressure that is forcing you to act in ways maybe beyond what you would do normally. And so this is an interesting dynamic of seeing, and I think that there is a respect necessary for both sides, of a respect of being in the system and recognizing these people really care about the issues, and maybe I have to look at doing something that's not so comfortable for me, as well as then coming from an activist point of view and not just seeing everyone as the enemy who isn't accomplishing the achievements that you think should be happening, and realizing that they do have hard choices that you don't quite have the freedom of as activists. So as someone who in your position has been, we could say now, they started out in academics, really a lifelong activist, but have been in conversation and relationship with many people inside the system, how would you characterize this relationship further?
Yeah, I think that both are necessary, and so probably we should do a better job on both sides of respecting the contributions of the other side, the insiders and the outsiders. If one is the weak link, then you're not going to accomplish as much as if both are strong. And that we probably can do a better job of communicating with one another, sitting down with one another, and helping understand each point of view, and perhaps even conspiring with one another to, in order to facilitate your insider activity, what do you need from us on the outside? Where's the pressure point that is going to open the mind of the person that you're dealing with? that there should be more collaboration between the two sides, and I think it's unnecessarily antagonistic. Sometimes there's a decent reason to be antagonistic, but I think most of the time, we should facilitate more conversations so that everybody understands what are the insiders trying to accomplish, what are the outsiders trying to accomplish, where are we stepping on each other's toes, and where are we pushing in the same direction, and maybe put a little more energy into those places and try to avoid the toe stepping a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I think that just generally probably makes sense. Again, it doesn't mean that every organization, institution is amenable. I am not I'll never buy anything from Chevron as long as I live, and that's an organization that I don't think is interested in the point of view of the owners of the company, the shareholders, not interested in the well-being of the communities where they work, and so I'm not interested in having much of a conversation with them. The people at the State Department, very much so. I think that would be very valuable. And again, the SAC, I stand 100% behind Scott Marcial when he says they just simply are not partners for dialogue. Mm. You can want it all you want, but it's not going to change. That they don't look at dialogue as a way to get to a compromise. They look at dialogue as a way to win.
Yeah, and that's how we end up in these cycles year after year.
And here we are. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I want to get also to divestment leading from the 1990s through the transition to present day, and also give a counter argument of this and hear your take on this counter argument, because this is something you've put so much thought into. And the counter argument is pretty simple. It's that maybe the conditions could always be better and we'll work to make them better, but they're employing people, and especially young women. And and this is an argument we've heard from people advocating responsible business post-coup. Even the EU even went as far as to, I don't know if you saw this a couple of years ago, putting out a video that was alarming people to the dangers of if you really put pressure on these factories to close down, that the young women would be turned to prostitution, among other things. And that had a major outcry from many Burmese of how offensive that was. But it is a counter argument that, look, we need some way, even in these times of post-coup, to say nothing of transition period where there were factories were operating much more so, but even during this time post-coup, we need to have some way to have some bare economy going, to be giving money to some people, and to just be stripping the whole thing away and not provide any opportunities. That we need to have a careful way of looking at this. So how do you respond when you hear those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, on reflection, I'm not convinced that the NLD's policy was correct. Now that we're, 25, 30 years later. Mm. So we can begin to analyze this stuff. We have the distance of time now. But these were difficult issues. So how do you come to a decision on a difficult issue? Do you flip a coin at the end? Well, in the case of Burma, you had the expressed will of the Burmese people choosing a political party to represent them. And so if that party is articulating a policy, it seems to me that it deserves the benefit of the doubt. And so, yes, and again, on reflection, I'm not saying that it was absolutely the right policy, but I am prepared to say that it was the proper policy to follow, given the circumstances where the one time people had been given the opportunity to express themselves, they had chosen leadership from the NLD, and the NLD's policy was this. So Did I know better than the NLD? Did somebody else know better than the NLD? I don't know. But what they had was legitimacy that others didn't have. But the truth, the point of all these boycotts was the Yadana project, right? And it didn't make sense to go to Unocal and say, you shouldn't be doing this, when Heineken was there, when Eddie Bauer was there, when various clothing manufacturers, whatever. So it was a matter of clearing the decks, right? We got the policy was articulated by the NLD. It was an anti-apartheid style struggle, and so then if we took that as our marching orders, which essentially we did, then we had to clear the decks so that we could get to Unocal, so that that billion and a half dollars a year going directly to the very top of the food chain in that country could be stopped. In 2003, the Bush administration imposed the import ban. We weren't even asking for the import ban. We didn't see that as, to me, that's a very, very broad range response. And I think the current focus on much more targeted sanctions is better. But it's just that awareness and those tools were not necessarily available back in the day. And so it's just very direct, trying to implement the NLD's policy.
And then what's your feeling with this argument with the factories are employing people, both during the transition, where there were concerns about the draconian states of those that were employed by the factories, their rights, labor rights, etc., and then especially after the coup. What's your thought about that issue?
Yeah, if I see some clothing made in Myanmar, nowadays, whatever, it's okay as far as I'm concerned. I know that labor rights protections are much weaker now than they were before the coup. It's very concerning, but there's no authoritative voice saying this shouldn't be taking place. And I'm not in a position to decide. The military does benefit modestly. The military does benefit modestly from this, but it's really the resource extraction. This is. We need to talk about the important stuff. And the important stuff is, honestly, is not sugar water, and it's not garments. Mm-hmm. It's resource extraction. Mm-hmm. It's Chinese influence. It's big stuff. Yeah. And not this smaller stuff. And the smaller stuff, it made sense because it was these were steps toward the big stuff. Mm-hmm. But now I think we just need to talk about the big stuff.
Let's do it then.
Yeah.
I mean, resource extraction in Myanmar, it's a huge business. It's a huge part of who owns land, who gets the revenue, the Chinese influence. And, I haven't seen anyone talking about this. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it. Maybe Burma is just so forgotten this isn't going to be an issue, but we see with the way that Trump has engaged with Ukraine, it's been on resource extraction. Have you put two and two together and had any concern about where we could see a new U.S. policy forming on Burma if it even rises to attention?
Yeah, I mean, if it rises to attention is an excellent question. And should we want it to or not is also, I think, a pretty good question that I don't know the answer to. But it is, I think, entirely possible. I think the last Trump administration, Burma kind of skated through and, so more or less things didn't change because nobody in Washington, D.C. was saying change. They just ignored it. And so everything just sort of kept going along. The rare earths stuff in Kachin, where now the Kachin are in control, whereas the Chinese were mining the heck out of that stuff, and it's environmentally very, very bad. There's a colleague suggested that perhaps it could be a way for the United States and India to muscle in a little bit there. The Chinese would hit the freaking ceiling, as you can possibly imagine, which, intended or unintended, that's a consequence, and you've got to be prepared to deal with that. But, is there a way, because rare earths are apparently really important and likely to remain important for all the high-tech manufacturing that's driving the world forward. So, I don't know whether there is a way. I asked an Indian colleague about it, and he kind of said, well, the mining companies are not going to step out of line. Whatever the Modi government says, that's what they're going to do. And I don't know whether the relation, it seems like Modi and Trump have a decent relationship, but I'm not sure it's at a, at a very sophisticated policy level, or whether it's just sort of two authoritarian, admiring guys getting along with one another. But it does seem that might be a place where you could get the attention of the Trump administration. Then you got to ask yourself, do you want the attention of the Trump administration or not?
Right. I want to ask a question about the trajectory and the flow of this advocacy movement that, again, you were at the ground level of, so it's so interesting to see where it's gone today. And I appreciate through the way that you've talked about your own involvement, you've often referenced following the concerns or the decrees of locals who are being impacted by something, or elected officials whose mandate by the people wasn't followed through, or you're not finding a cause that you want to advocate and bang the drum on. You're following the lead of those voices that because of the lack of freedoms there aren't able to speak for themselves in the way they would like, and so you're hearing those voices and trying to amplify them and to create change here. Much of what you've done has followed somewhat of that pattern. As we look at the shape of how the advocacy movement has grown from the 80s and the 90s and on, I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is more of a lay view of not having lived through these years and interacting with some part of them. But my feeling was that as this infrastructure, we could say, started to develop, there did come to be, you could say, kind of gatekeepers or authorities, people that would, and especially in the nature of Burma being such a closed country and lack of information age as we see today, this sense of whether it's an academic or an activist or some representative, this sense of saying, well, let me tell you what things are really going on. Let me be the embodiment of the real voice and the real lens for what you need to understand about this. And so in that position came a lot of power, and came a platform to be able to get attention, to be able to get funds, to be able to direct policy and have voice. And it seems to me that Cyclone Nargis changed a lot of that up. Because I came to Burma, I came first in 2003, but I came there to live in 2007 and lived there from 2007 until the coup. And the Burma that I came into felt very different than the Burma that I was hearing about. And as I was on the ground, and I was there before Nargis, a year before Nargis, I started to become aware of this tension between those of us that were in country doing things, whether we were non-Burmese or Burmese, and those that were in Mesot or DC. And I heard a characterization that in some ways, for them to continue the activities and the funding they were getting, they actually needed to characterize the situation in Burma as more hopeless than it was. Because why in the world would you send funds into Burma when there was nothing, when there was no hope with that? They needed to go to Mesot and DC and other places to do their work. Nargis changed that, and I've talked to American policymakers who've described how Nargis opened up this possibility of looking at civil society in a different way, that sometimes you can support an emerging civil society that wasn't democracy with a big D or human rights with a big HR, but we're doing other ways of filling in those gaps. And that were also kind of seen beyond the descriptions that some of these more prominent, you could say, gatekeepers were holding on to, that they weren't, for their own benefit perhaps, they weren't exactly describing, you know, the how one really could engage. And so then there started to be more interest in what can we do here. Then came the transition, and in some ways I could say that then there was an overcompensation where it went too far on the other side, because then you had a situation where it was, for those that were kind of hyping the transition as a win, as you say, it was this sense of, well, of course everyone can go back to Burma. Of course things are getting better. Why in the world would we want to support anything outside of Burma when everyone can now go back and we want to build up this country? Well, okay, that might be one thing for a Bamar living in middle class and urban place, but what about all the ethnic minorities and religious minorities that are suffering in other ways? This is an overcompensated view that there are people who really can't go back and they need to continue doing their work outside, as well as, you know, I was talking to someone the other day in media, and they were saying, you know, these independent media, they were so sharp because even during this time of transition, a lot of them never fully moved shop because they never trusted it. So they knew that. So funders that were arguing, look, you could all go back now, it's safe. Well, okay, that's an overcompensation of the view. And so I'm painting this picture as we go from 1988 through the transition and then up until today, that there's a way of advocacy that is following in the wishes of those that have a clear voice but aren't able to use it effectively. But then that can, and not to say there's a lot of bad actors out there, sometimes it just happens, just the organic nature of the beast, that somehow when you start to fill that position, you then have a fear of losing that position, and that can distort the reality that you're trying to describe.
Well, it is, you know, the inside versus outside dynamic has always been there. And honestly, I used to know all the NCGUB guys, and Dr. Sainwin slept on my floor at my house. And I used to hear people on the inside complaining about how the NCGUB is living large and they got all this money. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any money whatsoever, you know. So it does work both ways. The perception of the people on the outside by people on the inside, and vice versa, is not always that accurate. And and I think that the military has very effectively given organizations a choice. You can work from the outside, or you can work from the inside, but you can't do both, right? If you're going to be inside, save the children or whatever, they make that decision, and then it becomes impossible to work from the outside in. They can only work from the inside out, which is very difficult then to reach the most vulnerable communities in the borderlands. That said, I think probably, there is definitely an element of truth of people on the outside telling the same story. Even though on the inside, I can remember Mary Callahan, whom I respect a great deal, talking in particular after Nargis, that civil society is just a whole different place than it was before, right? There's real stuff happening here, and you can support that, and you're supporting something really useful. I work with an organization now that has been providing support in the Yadana pipeline area. And there was one group that we funded early on that was a sewing circle, women's sewing circle, so that they could sew and make make money from selling stuff in their community. And over time, that morphed into a group that brought a lawsuit against the Navy for land grabbing.
Wow. And
so, that's a reminder to me that what we think we're supporting is, we don't even know. What these people are capable of is much beyond what they're doing right now.
Yeah.
So if we support the sewing circle, we may be helping to create an organization that can create real change at scale. And so, the idea of listening to the voices on the ground, identifying people who are leading effectively, asking them what they need and then giving it to them seems to me that from the outsider point of view. And so I'm doing a little less advocacy now and a little more sort of humanitarian focused stuff now. Although I'm still involved with U.S. Campaign for Burma, that is very much an advocacy organization. Listening is an underrated skill all across human activity.
Right.
And certainly when you're trying to help a community, it seems to me that the number one thing that you need to be able to do is listen. And it wasn't that easy when the isolation was very strong between outside and inside. Then during the opening period, it was possible, for each side to understand each other.
If they chose to.
If they chose to, right? Yeah, and that's always. But I haven't run across too many nefarious. There just weren't that many resources. If you're greedy, go somewhere else because there wasn't money for anybody. Nobody got rich. Nobody got rich, and anybody who thinks so is just way off base. You want to get rich, go do something else. I wonder now. You talk to people. You can go to Yangon and you can get a tourist visa if you want to, and you're not going to go to a lot of places that you used to go. And people, they can come back and say, "Oh, I was there, and it was, it was fine, no big deal." Well, that's a reality, but it's not really the reality, and that was always part of it too, is the difference between the Yangon perception and the upcountry perception, and so many experts, people showed up in Yangon and never left, and the money never left, and they thought they were living in Burma, and they really were just living in Yangon,
I appreciate saying how our job is to listen and to emphasize the listening of those that are telling their story, and to see where we can fit in to support. The next step beyond listening is, as we talked about at the beginning, creating a narrative. And that's where the hard, tricky part comes in, even if you are trying to be as authentic and accurate as you can. Because, as mentioned, the mere crafting of a narrative, it is an intentional cherry picking and sequence of facts, of truth, but using that truth to tell a story, which is, no narrative is going to be exactly without some kind of fault or simplification. That's just the nature of what a narrative is. And you describe how the narrative was just it couldn't have been clearer in the 1990s, and Aung San Suu Kyi couldn't have been a greater icon, and therein we have her fall and the fallout from that. And going way back years ago, when we talked to our mutual friend Michael Hack on this show, and he was talking just in 2021, he was talking about his work of trying to figure out what that 2021 narrative would be, just commenting on how in a double bind they were of one, anyone that would have supported earlier or had supported earlier through the figure of Aung San Suu Kyi was now just not willing to engage, but downright pissed off and, furious because they had a simplistic reaction to a simplistic narrative, and the pieces didn't fit together and they didn't want to hear any more. And Michael Hack was saying, we need a new narrative, but there's this vacuum, and what better fills a vacuum than a dynamic figure? But isn't that what we did last time, and it didn't work last time? And so what is the narrative this time? How do we fit that in?
I think that the narrative that's dominating right now is a fear of disintegration of an existing nation state. And, Syria is another, Libya is another. And it seems that the modern contemporary world, we're here in Thailand right now, the Thai government is absolutely scared to death of essentially political disintegration on that side, India as well. So that's, I think, the dominant narrative. And so I think that the discussion that we need to promote on the activist side is a more nuanced view. First of all, who has been the institution creating the most instability in that country? Well, it's the military. The military that the Thais want to perceive is the government. And, so we need to look beyond a very simplistic, it falls apart, then it's Yugoslavia, although, now Yugoslavia is former Yugoslavia. It's a lot better off than Burma is, anyway. So I think what we need to be looking at is what sort of post-military federalism, balance of power. There was an article, I think it ran in Irrawaddy last November or so, where they talked about a mandala. The mandala as the reality of political life in Burma is, there are many power nodes, and how they relate to each other. They're all relating to each other in all directions. Very complicated. It's very complicated. What can you say? It's complicated. But that that struck me as, that's a lot how it looks. Is it acceptable to imagine a future based on that, when the unitary nation state is the only thing that seems to make a lot of people comfortable, even if within that nation state is the most outlandish suffering you could, the humanitarian suffering going on right now, 500-pound bombs dropped on wedding parties, it's horrendous. And so I'm not willing to accept Burma as a unified nation state is the only way to imagine that particular geography. And so I think that's, but that's a real uphill struggle.
It's never been a unified nation state, ever in history.
Right. So it's one of these, lines on a map. And again, Syria is a great example of very ignorant drawing of lines on a map and then saying, oh, this is now a nation state. Well, it isn't. Just because you say it is doesn't actually mean that it is. But there's a seat at the United Nations and all these sort of things come along with that, and we're just so married to it. So again, I think that all these years, we're taking on sort of the corporate power structure. We're taking on the idea of the nation state. Like these are really hard things, and if we're not successful at it, we should be somewhat gentle toward ourselves, because this is really, really hard. But I do think that what we need to be talking about most of all is the post-military state, and there are some reasons to have some optimism about that, and I think we need to be playing those up as much as we can.
It's interesting because you're painting a picture almost in opposition of these two concepts of, first, what is actually good for the people of Burma, and what sense does it make to try to bring together something which has only ever been an idea. There is, as I said, it's never actually happened. There's never been a day in recorded history where these lines on a map actually form something. And yet that's what we're trying to form now. So we're not even going back to an imagined past. We're going to an aspiration of a future, and we don't even know what that aspiration is because there's so many different peoples and what is going to be good for those peoples. That's one idea. And that idea is contrasting or maybe combating with the international world order of what these things like sovereignty means, nation states, United Nations recognition, and et cetera. And these puzzle pieces are just not fitting.
Yeah, it is very difficult. Why do we end up with all this difficult stuff? Why can't it be easy? But it isn't easy, and it isn't easy for anyone here. And we're sitting in comfort we're not suffering the way people not so far away from here are truly suffering. And I think as much as possible, we just need to keep them first and foremost in our minds. But the idea of not supporting their efforts out of fear that Burma as a nation state will cease to be when, as you said, it never existed. It doesn't actually exist right now. Is to me that's kind of ridiculous and not respectful of the suffering that people are going through right now. So I think it's even our obligation to consider, what it can look like. Can it survive within the framework of the nation state, as the World Bank and United Nations and all the big organizations, multilaterals, only envision the world that way. That's the only way they look at it. Yeah. So can it be done within it and still make them comfortable? I don't know, but I think that's the conversation we got to be having, and not how do we how do we shore up the existing nation state, because it is not serving the well-being of the people of the country.
That's right. That's right. The other thing I want to ask you is you come from a background of academia and history, and you were thrown into the activist world by just terrible things happening and feeling that you couldn't just stand by. And this brings into discussion an interesting dynamic again between academia and scholarship and conflict and what's happening. And I've heard from some people in the field that there was somewhat of a troubling thing in the 90s and 2000s, that there were Western scholars that were having access to Burma, to their scholarship, and they weren't, there's a couple names we could put out there that have been known as military apologists, but there are others that weren't necessarily military apologists, but they understood that there was somewhat of a bargain there, that their access as Western, as privileged, protected Westerners that were studying a field that was that had limited access, that their ability to go and live and study there meant that their work couldn't really call out the military for who they were in quite those terms. They kind of had to leave, not so much be an apologist for them, but at least leave them to the side as they worked on their other stuff. You talked about your background in academia before 1988, and you said, I was never political. I was never really interested in that part of it. And it's always interesting when someone uses those words, to unpacking those words, you can go to some places. And yet, when the things happen after 88 and in the 90s, this background you had of not being political suddenly turned into, it's not about politics, I have to do something. I have a moral right to engage and to do something. But I think that is the argument that those Western academics would make of like, well, I'm not political. I'm just studying this or this aspect of it.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was a period where I think, again, the Burma Studies Center, their annual national meeting, it was overt that we're not doing politics here. If you want to talk about ceramics during the Bagan era, absolutely, but we're not going to talk about politics. And I think that's really unacceptable, right? Because that really is disallowing dialogue about important topics. And it was probably realistic because, if academics engaged with those issues, they would be, academics writ large would probably have less access to the country, but nonetheless, I think it was just not the right decision. It's just so happens that you're studying a place that's very controversial, that's in political turmoil, and where people being harmed because of that. And if that makes your academic life more difficult, I'm sorry. You probably should have studied somewhere else. Right. Could pick some other country. yeah, I don't know in the contemporary scene whether it's, Elliot at Singapore National University, or he could probably draw on that more effectively than I could. But I think, it gets back to this: how do we simplify the narrative so that people can hear it, can respond to it? And academics, they don't care about that, right? So the nuance and the complexity that's their joy, right? That's where it gets really interesting, is once you get into these but it's not going to help you get humanitarian assistance across the border.
Mm-hmm.
If you want humanitarian assistance, you got to talk about people suffering and how you alleviate the suffering, and that's a pretty simple discussion. And you don't really want to get into all the which faction of the Quran are you talking about, and and on and on and on. So there is still that, and always going to be that tension between the academic side, and sometimes this. Yeah, I wasn't political, right? Or visit Myanmar year in 1996 when the NLD had said don't visit Myanmar, right? So I'm not going there I'm just going there as a tourist.
Yeah.
Well, the visit is a political act, whether you accept that or not. It is, it is a political act. And I think that's probably true for a lot of things, where we find it inconvenient to accept the full responsibility for our actions. Almost everything is a political act, whether you like it or not. And maybe this is part of the miseducation of Larry Dohrs, right? Is essentially discovering that. And so, you have to, if you're a responsible citizen, take responsibility for the political nature of your activities, no matter if it's in academia, if it's in tourism, whatever it is. So,
thank you. I have just one last question to wrap it up, and that's, and I'm thinking of course, the present day and all the turmoil and the suffering that's going on. And as I'm thinking of that, the one image that really comes to mind is the story that you referenced of these Vietnam vets that would collect the human rights documentations and copy them, and it would just be pages and pages and pages. And that imagery is so powerful in two ways. One is that it shows how many people are caring and trying, and the risk that they're taking, and the effort that they're putting forth, especially before the information age that we have today, where things are so accessible. And you actually, I'm thinking the rooms filled with papers, and be like, well, that's like not even a quarter of a thumb drive now, but but that's what they're doing now. That's what they're doing then. That's what it takes to be able to get that out there. And so in some ways, it's something that's so inspiring to hear how many people care and how much they're risking, how much of their own resources they're spending to do it. In other ways, I hear that and I just want to kind of punch the wall or pull my hair out, because it was like, what year were you talking about that this was happening? And like these same, I guarantee you can give me one of those pieces of paper right now, take off the year, and it's going to be what happened yesterday. And it's like, what does it take? Like, why is it that all of this effort, I don't want to say all this effort's for naught, because that's not true. I'm sure that it relieved a lot of people and did a lot of good, but it's just so frustrating that you could take the year off of these paper and all of these work and these risks that people were doing back then, and we're in this same situation right now, or maybe we're in a different stage of that cycle. And so and not to say that to be disheartened or feel like stop the effort, but because certainly that's what it takes to keep going forward. But just this sense of pain and hearing that of like all of this effort, and we're still here right now. So what's going on? What do we have to do different? How do we engage in a different way so that the conversations that we're having now on this podcast are not things that 20, 30 years in the future people are listening to and saying like, boy, I could have heard this conversation yesterday and it's still happening. We don't want this to be the future. And so these pages and pages of human rights documentations, how do we celebrate that people are putting forth this effort, but how do we just what do we have to do to not fill up more rooms in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, and if I had the answer, I probably would be richer and more important or something. But yeah, it is frustrating, and over the years, for those of us who have a choice, I know plenty of people who've walked away from the movement because they just found it too damn frustrating. You know, that we do seem to be in an endless cycle, going around and around, and not improving. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm an optimist, right? So I'm going to be optimistic. I believe that it is possible for these wonderful people, these wonderful human beings who we encounter when we spend time there, to have a political structure around them that better reflects the nature of the people. You know, the kindness, thoughtfulness that is just second nature in that country. So, but the stick with it thing is a tough one. And maybe this would be appropriate, I don't know. But when Mairead Maguire came to Seattle in the probably 93, 94, and I took her out to dinner, and I said, there's some tension in my family because I have one child, another one coming not so far in the future. Need to make money to pay the mortgage, all that kind of thing. And human rights advocacy is not really a way to make good money. How do I balance the family and the commitment to this larger issue? And she said, these issues are going to outlive you, right? Whether you like it or not, these issues are going to outlive you. So what we need is for you to be able to sustain your commitment. And only you are in a position to decide how far you can push yourself and still sustain. Because another thing we've seen people burn out. They come in, they go crazy for 2 years, and you never see them again. Well, that's not as helpful as as you would want. So and I took that to heart. I think that's actually very wise. Because I feel guilty, I live a comfortable life. I eat well, I sleep in a comfortable bed, and the people for whom, I advocate do not have those joys in their lives. And but to assuage my guilt, I go back to what Mairead told me face to face, and that is that I have to do it in a way that I can stay at it. And that, I think, does not get at the, is it just going to be another 1 or 2 cycles in 20 years, 30 years, and we'll be looking at more or less the same issues? Or is there a way out? But I think the commitment to sustain is as important as anything. And, if I can, I'll continue to do my small part, and I know that you will, and I know that a lot of the people who listen to this podcast, it's the same thing, and I think sports was a good place to learn that if you trained hard, played hard, did your best, and you lost, it didn't hurt as bad as if you had not prepared, and then you lost. Then getting a good night's sleep was going to be hard. So I think we just need to keep trying and believe that the wonderful people that we in a small way serve will find a way.
Well, thank you very much for your time today and for telling us your life journey as it corresponds with the trajectory of Burma. And invite you, if there's any last things that the conversation hasn't touched upon that you'd like to share here, to feel free to do so.
Well, I mean, the one thing, and it is another whole discussion, so I don't want to take it there, but these scam centers along the border,
right?
The money that's being generated by those dwarfs the natural gas revenues, and it's a real big problem. And it's sort of kind of a little bit being addressed finally, slightly, but it seems like you crush it in one place and it pops up in 3 new ones. And this, so it's not necessarily just a problem of Burma, but it is something we're gonna have to be dealing with. And again, I don't know whether the Trump administration is open to a discussion about it, and I don't know whether we want them to be. But this is a real serious issue.
It's really concerning because it just, I mentioned my concern about the factories, and you say don't look at the factories. The real issue here is the rare earths and the natural resource extraction. And now you just say, well, actually, don't look at that. This is only a several billion-dollar industry. Don't look at that. What you need to look at is the scam centers. But yeah, this is another thing which thrives in a place of lawlessness and tyranny and conflict, and corruption. And so this, the revenues and the danger to the world order. And this is, this also goes back to thinking about advocacy, because one of the keys that you did in the 1990s was to tie the global concerns of justice and issues that people were looking at into how Burma fit into that. And so this is something that naturally one would hope that this would go in. The problem to me feels like, I'm naturally an optimist too, but this is a pessimistic take, is that it did feel in the 90s that the world was trending towards a sense of freedom and openness and belief, and things were tilting in that way. That does not feel like what's happening in 2025. It seems like we're having a global battle of light and darkness. We're having a global battle of tyranny and freedom and what these things mean. And we're living in a Orwellian state where freedom is tyranny and we don't even know what words mean anymore. And so, I think in a normal state of affairs, whatever that means, to tie in the Burma concern to the global concern of everything the scam centers represent, of elderly ladies in Ohio being stripped of everything they have, and human trafficking and torture and the worst scenes imaginable. This would fit into a narrative that everyone should and could care about, not just because it's something terrible happening in the world, but because and not just that it's their involvement or complicitness in a corrupt system, but because they're victims of this as well. They are directly impacted, and yet that's assuming that you have some functioning ethics and world order and rule of law in other places, which I don't know if we do so much right now. So
yeah, no, you're absolutely correct, but I think it is that big an issue, and we're working on getting the attention to it, because I believe it's a way to highlight what's going on in Burma by telling this story, and it is being told more and more, but it gets distorted in the process. So we just want the truth. We just want people to understand the importance of all this, and the importance of stopping it as best we can.
Thank you for listening to this episode in full. By this point, we've aired a few hundred episodes, with many more scheduled, and every single one of them is available at no charge. We are committed to keeping our platform freely accessible into the foreseeable future so that anyone, anywhere, can learn about the situation in Myanmar. At a time when keeping global awareness on the country is so critical, it's more important than ever to share these stories widely. So to ensure that we can continue offering these programs without any barriers or paywalls in the way, we've launched a membership program. Becoming a member not only helps us in this drive to sustain our platform and bring you more vital interviews, it also comes with benefits like advanced releases, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive discounts at our shop, and more. So if you'd like to support us and gain access to these perks, visit insightmyanmar.org/membership to learn more. Thank you for being a part of this mission. Of course, we also welcome contributions of any kind as well, and invite you to visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to learn more about the ways that you can contribute.
Bodaba, Yarananga, Unyana, Dadu, Yadana, Yadana, Zadamana, Besayana, Besaya. Oba, Yarananda, Dayananga, Yarana, Diana, Bodaba, Yarana.